Oh God, it's a bit scary up here. Just think of the wine later, Joe. Think of the wine. We'll get through it. Yeah. Welcome, everybody, to beautiful Perth. I've lived here for 8 years, and it's an amazing place. So if you do get a chance to look around Perth outside of the conference, please do, and enjoy the city. My name is Jo. I'm a speech pathologist. This is my colleague Claire. She's a physiotherapist. But we also wear a different hat as we coordinate clinical drug trials in neurological diseases here at the Perrin Institute in Perth. We'd like to acknowledge our clinical manager, Sue Walters, who's in the audience somewhere at the back, just for her support throughout this project and allowing us to be flexible with our time to be able to do this. And the people, of course, who work within our team at the clinical trials, and mostly to our patients. So coordinating clinical trials includes, but is not limited to, finding and selecting appropriate patients and providing screening assessments, baseline and post-study measures. A bit of background information. Good clinical trial recruitment is critical to the success of clinical trials, and no more so than in MND. Whilst there has been some advances to therapeutic approaches to MND, there have been limited disease-modifying options, and clinical trials aim to improve this. These limited options should mean easier recruitment, but in our experience, this has been far from easy. Why? For the 3 MND trials that we have conducted so far over the last 18 months here in Perth, eligibility is highly dependent on respiratory measurement, and patients often fail to meet the slow vital capacity percentage that's required for entry to the study. So let's just take a closer look at some of the problems with recruitment that we have. There's 3 that are outlined there, which is not the premise of this talk today, but we face quite a few barriers along the way. But actually finding patients willing to participate in MND trials isn't that difficult, as the risk of being on a placebo doesn't often concern them. They don't have anything to lose. And often, their reasons for being on the trial are altruistic. According to the FDA, only 6% of clinical trials are completed on time, and 80% are delayed by at least a month because of unfulfilled enrolment. 2/3 of trial sites fail to meet their original enrolment goals. Why? Our most significant barrier has been finding patients who meet the eligibility criteria, and we're not alone. A recent stakeholder survey in 2015 looked at barriers to clinical trial recruitment and found that the most significant barrier was finding or identifying patients who met the eligibility criteria. Inclusion criteria related to respiratory function has resulted in low recruitment rates at our site, with most patients being reviewed clinically only every 3 months for their MND. Capturing the right patients at the right time point can be very difficult. So let's just take a closer look at our clinical management of MND in WA. There are approximately 180 people living with the disease. We have 3 MND multidisciplinary team clinics that operate across the state. And the method and frequency of respiratory testing varies across the 3 MND sites, which Claire will go into a little bit later. Let's look a bit more closely at an example where eligibility criteria impacted on our ability to recruit to a recent MND trial. This was a phase 2 trial which aimed to recruit 450 patients globally. The primary endpoint was to improve respiratory function as measured by slow vital capacity. Our site agreed to enroll 8 patients. 10 patients were screened between September 2018 and April 2019. Only 2 patients were eligible, and they were recruited to the study. 8 patients failed to meet the eligibility criteria, with 75% of them failing to meet the slow vital capacity measurement of between 65 and 90%. So, by April 2019, we were very short of our enrolment goal, and we decided to address our approach to recruitment. So our objective was to increase clinical trial recruitment through close monitoring of respiratory function. So just recall at this point, we only had 2 patients recruited onto the trial, and we wanted to increase this before the trial closed for recruitment. And a lot of these studies are competitive recruitment, these global studies, so it's quite hard work. We had some clinical questions which we wanted to explore, which would assist in our approach. Do we have a trajectory of respiratory deterioration in MND? We know that the rate at which MND progresses varies greatly amongst patients. Is this more predictable once respiratory decline starts? If so, can we predict decline in those who were over but close to 90%? What are the recommended procedures for monitoring respiratory function? And how often is respiratory function measured in MND patients in WA? The variability of the disease makes it difficult to individualise prognostic information and therefore know the ideal frequency of respiratory testing.
So to help, we had a look at the literature to see what was recommended in terms of monitoring respiratory function. An evidence-based review in 2006 by Heffernan et al. Advised to routinely perform respiratory function tests, the forced vital capacity, and where possible, the sniff nasal inspiratory pressure in all MND patients in outpatient clinics. And they advised to do this as soon as the diagnosis was made, ongoing to routinely check for signs and symptoms of respiratory insufficiency, but no specific frequency was determined, and they proposed every 3 months. The level of evidence that this was based on was level 3, that was a suggestion for clinical management based on expert opinion. And the articles were also from 1999 and 2002, so we then wanted to see was there anything more frequent to give us more information. The BMJ best practice guidelines indicate to monitor for respiratory decline with FVC is recommended every 3 months. And the latest NICE guidelines, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence from 2016, but they've been updated in July this year, state for respiratory function tests to be done as part of the initial assessment to diagnose MND using the forced vital capacity or vital capacity. And then for a healthcare professional with appropriate competencies, should perform the respiratory function tests every 2 to 3 months, although the tests can be performed more or less often, depending on whether there are signs and symptoms of respiratory insufficiency, the rate of progression of MND, and it may be the person's preference or circumstances. So then we needed to look at how does our current practice of clinical respiratory measurement in WA compare to this. So as Joe mentioned, there are 3 MND clinics in WA. The first site is our site, where we have access physio to a portable spirometry device, which we can use when required, which is currently being used on an as and when basis. Otherwise, patients are reviewed approximately every 3 to 4 months at the respiratory clinic. At the other 2 sites in WA, the patients are reviewed every 3 to 4 months at the respiratory clinic. So the advantage of having the physio with the portable device is we're getting an instant result. And the disadvantage with the respiratory clinic is the delay in getting patients referred there and getting appointments, and then the delay in getting the assessment results back. And also the physicians there are not part of the MND clinic, so not involved in the MDT clinical decisions being made. The other thing is a lot of clinical trials are actually using SVC, and if we're measuring FVC, we wanted to know as to whether these measures correlate and they were interchangeable. So a study in 2016 by Pinto et al. Looked at 592 patients over a 14-year period with ALS, and they tested them at baseline and at 4 months. They tested both the FVC and the SVC in a sitting position, and they found that they were strongly correlated. They also came up with a mean decrease in terms of percentage per month for the FVC and the SVC. So we're thinking, could we use this data to screen those borderline patients more regularly to improve their access to clinical trials? So an example would be if someone we screened for the trial that we mentioned that was wanting between 65 to 90% for inclusion. Initially they were 94%, they were too good for inclusion. If we applied that mean decrease of 2.51% per month from the previous article, then they would have been eligible at 2 months, so we could get them in earlier and increase their access to the clinical trial. We do know, however, that patients do vary significantly in terms of their rate of decline. So what we did is we then reviewed the medical notes across the 3 clinics between April and June this year to pre-screen potential patients, and also looking at identifying those patients that were close to that but above 90% on recent measures, so using the portable respiratory device to see if they were then eligible. So our results. In that time frame from April to June, we identified 7 patients that were suitable, that had that FVC close to 90%. They were all assessed using the portable device. 4 of them were still above 90%. Of that, 3 of them had a stable SVC result of close to 95%. And one of them with the SVC of 94% had only declined about 1% per 2 months, which was actually different to what we'd found from that article, had suggested about 2.15% per month. 1 patient was lower, so at 59%, and then 2 patients met the criteria and they were enrolled in the study. When we started looking at this in April, they were at about 380 patients globally out of 450 that they wanted. But then in June, they unexpectedly closed recruitment early. So we were unable to fulfil our enrolment goal. So where to from now?
Yeah, so we can't change the eligibility criteria. It's there for a reason. But we can try and change our approach, and as I said, we tried to do that, and obviously recruitment clause, and this is the nature of clinical trials, I'm afraid. But we have looked at recommendations for future trials and have started to change our practice because of that. So here are some of the recommendations that we have suggested. We are wondering, at our site, as Claire said, we're using a portable SVC, and we have that, and we can call on the physiotherapist to check SVC during that clinic appointment. But can we make SVC measurement a standard across all our clinic sites? Will this help to improve more timely clinical management as well as benefiting for clinical trial recruitment? We have started to develop already a clinical trials patient database for motor neuron disease, and we have this for other disease types. So we've developed a MS database, for example, where we can track patients, and perhaps we can do this for motor neuron disease where we can track their SVC results and other results, and then be able to use that to check for their suitability for trials. Reviewing eligibility criteria earlier for clinical trials, because we've done 3 now, we're a little bit more aware of what they're expecting. So we are a little bit more prepared in terms of being able to look through patients' notes and find out more information and track those patients so we can get them in early, because it's very, very time consuming. And finally, education of our allied health professionals who work within those teams, because evidence does suggest that more successful recruitment rates and higher positive research awareness has been associated with MDT teams' involvement in recruitment of trials. So we weren't successful on this occasion, but this allowed us to look at recruitment for a trial that we're just running at the moment. So we've just opened recruitment to a new MND clinical drug trial with SVC measurement being the primary endpoint and therefore an inclusion criteria. We started early, so we've identified patients and we've tracked their SVC results so we can see who may be ready to be included in the trial. We've started to develop an MND database already. As I said, we've already started that. Portable SVC measurement isn't being used across all 3 sites, but we are using it on our site, and we're looking at expanding that to detect and track respiratory compromise. Or can we use it when those patients who've got early signs of possible respiratory change, such as regular waking with headache, can we use it to track those patients more readily or more frequently? And finally, Claire and I have done some education to allied health professional groups. We're yet to get to our MND groups because we also run trials on other neurological diseases, but we will get to our trial sites to those MND groups of allied health professionals. And this is a photograph of a recent recruit. So we just screened this lady last week, and she got an incredible SVC score. I can't quite remember what it was, but we managed to recruit her. So she's our first recruit to our clinical trial. These are our references, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for your presentation. That was great. Has anybody got any questions? Yes, we've got one at the back here.
Thank you for the great presentation. As a respiratory physician myself, I'm always interested in understanding and learning the progression of respiratory function testing. But what is unique for an MND patient is that they also have a bulbar onset disease. And you might find that their seal for the particular spirometer that you're using, particularly the portable spirometer, may actually underestimate their recording. How do you propose that you're going to overcome this sort of limitation in your recruitment?
That's interesting because we are given a spirometer by the sponsor that we have to use. We don't have much flexibility in what we can use.
Could I then suggest that you may actually have to modify the mouthpiece? This is what I do in my practice, is that rather than using the mouthpiece, because some MND patients just cannot have a proper seal of their mouthpiece, but we use a particular mask, so it's more like an anesthetic mask, and it has to have a filter at the end of it as well, and it's a one-way mask filter. So then it's sort of, hopefully, the whole idea is to actually take away that mouth seal issues, that you can have the air leak on the side, and therefore give you an underestimate true value of the vital capacity of the patient. I'm happy to talk to you about it later.
Yeah, definitely. We'll say that we are very restricted in trials, though, even in terms of what we use. So we have to ask permission. So, for example, one of the trials we use, they will say they'll allow us to hold the lips around this to help seal, but they wouldn't allow us to use any other equipment. So it's very restrictive. It's the same as patients with poor posture. They may say to us they want a sitting SVC, and that patient can do a really good SVC in a supine position, but we can't put them in that position for screening. So it's kind of not like your regular clinical work. We're very, very restricted to what we can use. But thank you. We'll catch you later about that. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Yes, we've got one over here.
Thank you. Pete Allcroft again. I agree with you, the difficulty in recruitment to clinical trials, because I've done a lot of them. A warning word, though, in South Australia, we have been banned from trawling notes. So you're implying you've got a database and you are trawling notes, and do you have consent from the patients to trawl through the notes? Because we've been banned.
Yeah.
We
get full consent from patients before we do any of that, and that's also a barrier because we have to get all of that consent first, especially when we're working with patients in different health teams, from the environment that we work in. But we have to get that patient's consent before we can get access to any of their medical notes, letters. That's a given.
Thank you. Anything else? That was great. Thank you very much.